The morning Cecily Vane refused the Duke of Wrenhollow's reward, the frost had not yet left the grass. She had risen before the household, before the kitchen fires were lit, before the scullery girls had rubbed the sleep from their eyes, and walked to the far edge of the kitchen garden, where the old orchard wall crumbled into lichen and stone. She went there every fortnight, had gone there for 14 months, always at an hour when no one was about to witness it, and no one would think to ask. She carried a small bundle, dried thyme from the still room, a few stems of late-flowering chamomile, and whatever the season had yielded from the rough patch of ground she had quietly cultivated along the wall. She knew nothing about the tree itself, except that it had been planted in a hurry, that no one on the household staff would name why, and that the ground around it was always neglected. She had decided, on a gray October morning during her 3rd week of service at Wrenhollow Park, that this neglect was wrong. She had not been asked to correct it. She corrected it anyway. On this particular morning in early November, she did not hear him until she had already laid the bundle at the base of the apple tree and straightened to go. Julian Ashcroft, Duke of Wrenhollow, stood 6 paces behind her on the gravel path, his dark coat silver with frost, his face as still as the stone wall at her back. She had never been this close to him outdoors. She had served at Wrenhollow for 14 months, without any occasion to be near him at all. His return from London 2 months prior had been quiet, methodical. The arrival of a man resuming a series of tasks rather than coming home. The household saw him at dinner and at his study door. The maid saw the surfaces he had walked across. He looked at the bundle she had laid. The dried thyme, the chamomile, a small sprig of something she had pressed and kept in her apron pocket since the previous week. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he looked at her. "You have been doing this," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, Your Grace." A silence. The frost-thickened air held it. "How long?" 14 months, Your Grace." His jaw tightened, or seemed to. The light was thin, and she may have imagined it. He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded note, held it toward her with the precise economy of a man accustomed to transactions completing themselves without discussion. "This should cover the cost of what you have spent, and the labor." Cecily looked at the note in his outstretched hand. She did not take it. "Thank you, Your Grace," she said, her voice level. But no. She heard the silence differently after she said it. It had a different quality than the silence before. Compressed, charged, uncertain of its own edges. The Duke of Wrenhollow was not a man who heard no. She understood that from the particular stillness that moved through him, something almost like surprise rearranging itself before it could be visible on his face. "No," he repeated. "No, Your Grace." He studied her for a moment longer than was comfortable. Then he put the note back in his coat. He said nothing further, but he did not leave immediately. He stood for one more breath looking at the tree, at the bundle she had left, at a point somewhere between the two that she could not identify. Then he turned and walked back toward the house with the same measured stride he had arrived in, and the frost grass closed behind him without a sound. She stood alone with the apple tree and the pale morning, and the question she had put into the world with that single small refusal. The question would not go away quietly. It was not designed to. If you have ever watched a woman choose principle over safety when the cost is real and the witnesses are few, you will know exactly what that morning cost her. Stay with this story. It is hers to tell. She had come to Wrenhollow Park in September of the previous year because Mrs. Booth, the housekeeper, had known her father. Not well. A brief correspondence, a recommendation passed between households in better days, but enough that when the letters from a solicitor's daughter appeared, asking quietly if there was any position available in a large household requiring letters, good sense, and willingness to work, Mrs. Booth had written back within the week. The letters had not mentioned why the solicitor's daughter was willing to take a housemaid's position. Mrs. Booth had not asked. She was 61 years old and had seen enough of the world to know that when a gentlewoman's daughter appeared at a servant's door with a reference and clean hands and an expression that had already made its peace with difficulty, the reason was almost certainly grief, almost certainly recent, and almost certainly not her fault. Henry Vane had been a solicitor of modest practice in the village of Ashby Cross, 30 miles east of Wren Hollow. He had handled estates, tenancy agreements, the occasional disputed will. He had been honest, methodical, and kind in the particular way of men who are also formal. One who kissed the top of his daughter's head each morning before opening his office and had taught her Latin declensions on Sunday afternoons because, he said, every mind deserved proper tools, regardless of the work it would eventually be put to. He had died 18 months before Cecily arrived at Wren Hollow, 3 weeks after a client named Hargrove had accused him publicly of misappropriating £400 from a trust he had administered for 15 years. The accusation had never been proved. It had also never been cleared. Hargrove had died of a fever before the matter could come to any formal resolution, and Henry Vane had gone to his own grave 2 weeks later, with the cloud still attached to his name like a burr that could not be pulled loose. Cecily had known her father. She had known him in the way a daughter knows a man she has watched every day of her life, in his habits, his small courtesies, his careful handwriting, his refusal to cut corners even when corners were all that could be cut. She knew he had not taken the money. She did not know what she could do about that knowledge from inside a housemaid's apron, but she had decided, quietly and without announcement, that she would not spend the rest of her life accepting charity in lieu of justice. She would work, she would save what could be saved, and she would not accept money that was offered because the world felt it owed her a certain softness in exchange for the injury it had done. This was why she had refused the Duke's reward. Not ingratitude. Not pride in the sense the household would have understood it. Something older and quieter and harder to name. The sense that taking the money would mean agreeing that her presence at the tree was a service rendered, a transaction completed. When it had been neither of those things. She had not tended the tree for pay. She had done it because the tree had looked abandoned, and she understood abandoned things. Mrs. Booth found her in the linen room that evening. "His Grace's steward came to me," the housekeeper said, pulling the door closed behind her. She was a compact woman with a face that had long ago decided to be useful rather than expressive. "He wished to know whether the upper housemaid, that is yourself, had been assigned to the kitchen garden." "I am not assigned to the kitchen garden." "No." Mrs. Booth looked at her for a moment. "He said that Her Grace the Dowager Duchess had remarked that you were a maid who does not know her place." Cecily folded the linen in her hands. "I see. I thought you ought to know it had been remarked." "I am grateful." Mrs. Booth studied her a moment more, then turned and left without further commentary. She was not a woman who added words where none were needed, and she had learned, in 14 months of watching her fold linens and carry coal scuttles and trim candles with the controlled precision of someone who had been raised for an entirely different life, that the girl would find her own footing without being pushed toward it. What Cecily did not know then, what she could not have seen from inside the quiet machinery of the household's lower floors, was that the Duke's steward had not been dispatched by the steward. He had been dispatched by the Duke. The days that followed arranged themselves in a pattern she did not immediately recognize as a pattern. On a Tuesday, she was sent to retrieve a forgotten letter from the Duke's study at an hour when he was meant to be out riding. He was not writing. He was at his desk. He looked up when she came in, looked down again when she retrieved the letter from the side table, and said, without any particular inflection, Was it cold this morning? She understood it was not a question about the weather. The frost had cleared by 8 o'clock, Your Grace. He said, and returned to the letter in his hand. On a Thursday, she was carrying an armful of pressed linen to the guest corridor when she came around a corner and found him standing in front of a small watercolor that had hung there for as long as she had worked at Wren Hollow. He was simply looking at it. She passed quietly, not interrupting. And he said, without turning, "The frame wants reglazing. Have it added to the estate order." "Yes, Your Grace." She was a housemaid. The estate order had nothing to do with her. She mentioned it to Mrs. Booth, who mentioned it to the steward, who filed it. 3 days later, the watercolor was gone from the wall, and Cecily found herself wondering whether he had noticed that she had handled the thing without confusion, had passed his instruction along without pointing out that it was not, technically, her instruction to receive. On a Saturday, there was a third encounter. She was in the library at the end of the day, replacing a volume that the visiting housekeeper's assistant had left on the wrong shelf, when she heard his step on the landing. She was on the library ladder, 6 rungs up, reaching for the gap where the volume belonged, and she heard the door open and understood, from the quality of the silence that followed, that he had seen her and had not left. She replaced the book. She came down from the ladder and turned. He was standing at the far end of the room with a folded letter in his hand and an expression that had resolved itself, by the time she faced him, into something deliberately neutral. She had caught, in the half-second before the neutrality settled, a quality she could not immediately name. Not surprise. Something beside surprise. Something that watched. "The east shelf was disordered," she said. "I have corrected it." "I see that," he said. A silence. The library held it differently than open rooms held silences, absorbed it, redistributed it among the spines of several hundred books. "Your father's library," he said. "Was it well ordered?" The question was unexpected enough that she answered it honestly, without the half-second of calculation she had learned to insert between stimuli and response. "He had a system," she said. "He organized by the year he had acquired them, rather than by subject. He said it was the history of a mind, and a mind was worth keeping intact." Julian looked at the shelves. He said nothing for a moment. "Walk with me," he said. She came down the last rung and stood at the foot of the ladder, and he crossed to her. Not slowly, not quickly. With the precise, unhurried stride of a man who has decided to cross a room. And they were closer than they had been at the tree, closer than the corridor encounters had permitted. She was aware of the exact distance between them with a specificity that her mind had no rational explanation for. The warmth of a body near in a winter room. The way he looked at her directly without apology, as if her face were a thing it was reasonable to look at. "Your Grace," she said, which was a way of maintaining the distance that was already maintained. But that said the word anyway. And he understood it, and stepped back by the precise increment required, and said simply, "Of course," and turned toward the door. She stood in the library for a moment after he had gone. Her pulse was making itself known in her wrists, in the hollow of her throat, in a dozen inconvenient places that had no business announcing themselves in a cold library in November. Command as protection, she might have named it eventually, had she possessed the vocabulary for the whole of it. She did not. What she experienced was something simpler and more confusing, the sense that she was being seen, with some regularity, by a man who appeared to have decided to see her, and that the seeing was doing something to the careful architecture she had built over the past 18 months, stone by stone, to keep herself upright inside a life she had not chosen. He was not warm. He was precise and contained and occasionally brusque in a way that had nothing to do with her specifically, and everything to do with the fact that he moved through the world as if it required constant management. She noticed, in the particular way of a woman who has had to be a careful observer of influential people for survival's sake, that there was a difference between the quality of his attention to the household generally and the quality of his attention to her specifically. She could not have explained it aloud. She felt it the way one feels a change in the weather before the clouds arrive. There was a morning, 12 days after the encounter at the tree, when a young kitchen girl named Nell came upstairs in distress. Nell was 13, new to the household, and had been accused by a visiting footman in the employ of the dowager's arriving guests of stealing a small silver card case from the visitor's travel box. The footman had made his accusation in front of 4 other servants and had not been quiet about it. Nell was crying. She was also, Cecily knew, entirely innocent. She had been in the kitchen with Cecily herself from the moment the guests had arrived until the moment the accusation had been made, because Cecily had sent her to mend a basket handle, and the girl had remained, talking in the aimless way of a lonely child who is grateful for a task that keeps her near an adult she trusts. Cecily went to find the footman. The steward was present, and 2 of the dowager's ladies' maids, and a cluster of kitchen staff who had gathered in the way of households when something significant is about to unfold. The footman was a large man and confident, and had the manner of someone who had been right before, and expected to be right again. Cecily stood in the kitchen doorway and said, quietly, that Miss Nell had not been near the visitors' rooms at any point in the afternoon, that she herself could attest to the girl's whereabouts for the full duration of the accusation's implied window, and that if the card case had gone missing, the household would do better to look more carefully at the travel box rather than at the servants who had not been near it. She said this plainly, without elevation, without anger, and she did it in full, without stopping when the footman attempted to speak over her. The card case was found later, inside a fold of the visitor's traveling coat. Nell was not dismissed. The footman did not apologize. Nell came to find her that evening in the still room, where Cecily was cataloging herbs by lamplight. The girl stood in the doorway for a moment without speaking, and then said, in the small formal voice of a child who has been practicing what to say, "Thank you for believing me, Miss Vane." Cecily looked at her. Nell was 13, with tired eyes and ink-stained fingers, and the particular expression of a child who has been frightened and is still coming down from the fright. Cecily thought of her father, who had believed in things that needed believing in without evidence. She thought of how much it had cost him, and how much it had been worth. "You were not near the rooms," Cecily said. "I knew where you were. I simply said what I knew." Nell nodded, as if this were a complete and sufficient answer, which it was. She went back to the kitchen. Cecily returned to the herbs. She did not know that the Duke had been standing in the corridor at the top of the servants' stair for the full duration of her quiet argument, listening. She did not know that he had remained there for the additional exchange with Nell either, and had heard the entire thing from above, in the particular stillness of a man who is trying to understand what he is observing, and finds, with each new observation, that his understanding is revising itself in a direction he had not anticipated. He did not tell her. She was not meant to know. There was something different about the way he looked at her the following morning when she brought hot water to his study doorway. Something different in the economy of his nod. As if he had added something to a private ledger she could not see, and found the sum more interesting than he had expected. If you have stayed this far, and I believe you have, You know already that this story is not about the reward. The reward was never the point. Stay a little longer. The hidden wound reveal came to her through the tree itself, and through Mrs. Booth, and through a letter she was not meant to read, but whose first line was visible when the wind caught the desk in the study and lifted the page just long enough. The name on the letter was Thomas Birch. She did not know the name. She asked Mrs. Booth that evening, carefully, whether there had been a Thomas in the household. Mrs. Booth looked at her for a long moment in the particular way she had of deciding whether a question deserved a full answer. Then she sat down. Thomas Birch had been 8 years old. He had been the son of Julian Ashcroft's closest friend from his time at Oxford, a man named Birch who had died in the early years of the war, when Thomas was barely 3, and whose wife had died of fever the following winter. Julian had taken the boy as his ward, had raised him, after a fashion, or as much as a duke with estates to manage and a parliamentary seat to occupy can raise a child, which meant that Thomas had had every material comfort, and a man who was present at Christmas, and who sent for him to ride out on the estate each spring, and who had written weekly letters in his careful hand, and who had also, inevitably, been absent in London in the autumn of 1812, when the boy developed a fever that the doctor misjudged twice before it became something the doctor could not manage at all. Julian had arrived at Wren Hollow 4 days after Thomas died. He had been 7 hours on the road and had not stopped to change horses. He had planted the apple tree himself, Mrs. Booth said, the following spring, when the ground had thawed. He had given it no marker, no stone, because he had not been able to decide what to write. He had been absent when he should have been present, and he could not think of a way to write that in stone that did not feel like a lie dressed as a memorial. He had not been back to the tree, not once in 2 years, not until the morning he had found Cecily there. She understood his coldness then, not as a character defect, as a man walking through the world with his hands pressed against a wound he could not reach and could not name, and was not sure he had the right to ask anyone else to touch. She sat with that understanding for a long time after Mrs. Booth had gone. The lamplight in the still room was thin and gold and very steady, and she thought about what it meant to plant a tree for a child you loved and then be unable to return to it. She thought about the parallels she was not permitted to speak aloud, a father whose name needed defending, a guardian whose absence could not be undone, both of them carrying the same shape of grief, separated by a staircase and the whole architecture of Regency England. The following morning she went to the tree before the household woke, as she always did. She laid the usual bundle. She stood for a moment in the cold air of the orchard and looked at the bare branches, and then she said, quietly, into the silence, that it was well tended. She did not know if this was for Thomas or for Julian or for herself. She supposed it did not matter. She was walking back through the kitchen garden when she heard him behind her. Not on the gravel path this time. He had come through the orchard gate from the south side of the estate, where he had apparently been riding, because he was still in his coat, and his horse was visible at the gate some distance behind him. He stopped when he saw her. She stopped. Between them, 10 feet of kitchen garden, frost on the cabbage leaves, the gray November light pressing down equally on both of them. He looked past her at the tree, then at her. Something crossed his face that she had not seen there before, not the controlled neutrality, not the studied brusqueness. Something that looked, briefly, like a man who has been somewhere very cold for a long time, and has unexpectedly come to a fire. He said nothing. She said nothing. After a moment he walked on, past her, toward the house, and she stood in the garden with her hands at her sides and the cold air in her lungs and a feeling in her chest so specific and so unasked for that it took her the rest of the morning to identify it as hope. She did not go to him. She would not have known what to say. And she did not presume that her understanding was something he had asked for. She carried it with her, the way she carried the sprig of thyme in her apron pocket. Not as a display, not as a burden, but as a thing that changed the weight of what she was carrying. The Dowager Duchess arrived at Wren Hollow for an extended stay on the 17th of November, and with her came Miss Lavinia Cowell. Lavinia Cowell was everything the season had designed. 24, fair, expensively gowned, the daughter of a family whose property bordered 3 of the Duke's eastern holdings and whose social standing had been accumulating interest for 2 generations. She was not unkind in any obvious way. She was simply a person who had been told her entire life that she was the correct choice for every room she entered, and she had absorbed this truth into her posture and her smile and the precise angle at which she held her fan. She surveyed Wren Hollow with the clear eye of someone taking inventory of what would shortly be hers. The household noticed. Households always notice. The Dowager settled into the drawing room with the authority of a woman returning to territory she had never fully relinquished, and began to shape the days according to her preferences. Dinner parties were arranged. Neighboring families were invited. The house took on the busy, organized quality of a stage being dressed for a performance, and at the center of all the activity, Julian moved through his own house with the contained, slightly watchful quality of a man who understood what was happening and had not yet decided what to do about it. He continued to see Cecily, not in any public or acknowledged way. There was no occasion for it, and he was not a man who manufactured occasions. In the crossing of corridors, in the brief exchanges that household life produced, she remained aware of the quality of his attention. He asked her once, in passing, whether she had ever read Cowper. She said yes. Her father had owned the poems. He said nothing further. But the following morning there was a small volume of Cowper's verse on the side table in the corridor outside the linen room, with no note and no explanation. She kept the book behind a loose stone in the still room. She read it in the evenings when the work was done. It was during a dinner for 12 that the second voicing arrived. The guests were county families. The conversation was bright and managed, and Cecily had no occasion to be in the dining room at all. She was carrying coals in the hall corridor when she heard the voices through the open service door, the particular carrying quality of a large room accustomed to being heard. The peculiarity, Miss Cowell was saying, in a voice calibrated to be amused, is that she refused it entirely. A reward, not inconsiderable, for tending a grave. I cannot decide whether it is pride or simply a maid who does not know her place. A ripple of polite laughter. I should think in either case the appropriate response is dismissal. More laughter. The door swung gently on its hinge. Cecily walked on. She did not examine how she felt about it until she was alone with the coal scuttle in the back corridor. And what she discovered, once she looked, was not hurt precisely, but something that had the same temperature. Not the dismissal of her worth, for she had known that was coming. Women in her position always knew. It was the laughter. The comfortable, assuming laughter of people who were accustomed to their understanding of the world being confirmed rather than questioned. She was still standing in the corridor, scuttle in hand, when the service door opened behind her and Julian came through it. He had clearly left the dining table, which was unusual. He looked at her, and then briefly, at the service door. And something moved across his face that she could not read in the candlelight of the back corridor. "Come inside," he said. It was an instruction. It was also, she understood from the way he delivered it, something else. Your Grace, she said. The coals. The coals will keep, he said, and held the door. She came inside. He did not explain. He returned to the dining room table, and she returned to the back stairs with the scuttle, and nothing had been said that could be pointed to or named. She stood for a moment at the foot of the stairs, with a warmth she had not expected in her sternum, in the place where cold air usually lived, and she permitted herself exactly 3 seconds to feel it, before she climbed the stairs and put the feeling away. The next morning, she encountered Lavinia Cowell in the upstairs corridor. This was unusual. Miss Cowell generally did not appear on the household side of the landing before noon. She looked at Cecily with a clear, assessing gaze, the gaze of a woman who has registered a variable she had not accounted for and is deciding what to do with the information. You are the housemaid who refused the reward, Miss Cowell said. Yes, Miss Cowell. Lavinia looked at her for a moment more, with an expression that was not precisely unkind. It was more clinical than cruel. The expression of a physician examining something unexpected in a patient otherwise expected to recover. Then she said, quite pleasantly, "How very strange," and walked on. Cecily watched her go. She thought about what it meant to be a person who had been told, their entire life, that they were the answer to the question every room was asking, and who had never been in a room that asked a different question. The observation was neither unkind nor satisfied. It was simply accurate, and it told her something about the shape of what was happening at Wrenhollow that she filed quietly in the part of herself that catalogued things worth knowing. That evening she found herself in the passage outside the library, not by design, but by the simple fact that the route between the linen closet and the back stairs ran past the library door, and the library door was slightly open, and through it she could hear Julian at the piano. He played rarely and alone, always late, and she had heard it before from the servants' side of the house without identifying it as loneliness. She identified it now, standing in the corridor with the linen in her arms. He was playing something slow and minor and slightly unresolved, the kind of piece that does not so much end as stop, because the player has reached the place in the music that he cannot continue past. She did not stop walking. She slowed slightly, for exactly the length of one phrase, and let it move through her like weather. 3 days later, Mrs. Booth came to find her. The housekeeper's expression had changed from its usual composed usefulness. It was careful now, in the way of someone carrying something that requires both hands. I must tell you something, Mrs. Booth said. Her Grace the Dowager spoke to Mr. Halsworth this morning. Halsworth was the steward. She asked him to look into the household records, the references. Mrs. Booth paused. Including yours. Cecily understood before the next sentence. She knows about your father, Mrs. Booth said. I do not know how. Perhaps a letter to someone in Ashby Cross, perhaps a connection I have not thought of. She knows the accusation. She intends to raise it tonight, at supper, in front of the Duke and Miss Cowell and the assembled guests, as evidence that you are unsuitable for the household. Another pause. That your continued refusal of the reward, in light of your father's disgrace, represents either irrational pride or deliberate deception. The corridor was very quiet. Cecily could hear the distant sound of the kitchen, the clatter of preparation. She has already called you a maid who does not know her place, Mrs. Booth said more quietly. She said it again this morning to Halsworth. She means to make it stick. Cecily stood with her hands at her sides. She thought of her father, of his careful handwriting, of the Sunday afternoons with Latin declensions, and the particular dignity with which he had always entered his own small office. Thank you, she said. for telling me." She did not run. She did not weep. She went upstairs and laid out the evening settings with steady hands, and she thought about what it meant to refuse a thing you could not afford to accept. The supper was 12 covers. The dowager waited until the second remove. She did not raise her voice. She never raised her voice. She simply mentioned, in the polished carry of a woman who understood exactly how a dining room worked acoustically, that she had been looking into the household and had discovered something that gave her pause. She said the word solicitor. She said the word accusation. She said the phrase 400 pounds with the careful precision of someone reading from a document rather than speaking from memory. The table went quiet. Miss Cowell set down her fork. Julian sat at the head of the table and looked at his mother. He had not interrupted. He had let her say all of it. This was not, Cecily would understand later, passivity. It was the particular patience of a man who wanted to hear the full extent of what was being said before he spoke. The dowager finished. A brief social silence expanded in the room, the kind that invites agreement by simply lasting long enough. Julian set down his wineglass. He pushed back his chair. He stood. He walked the length of the dining room without haste, through the door and into the entrance hall. Cecily was in the hall corridor with the second wine service, and he was in front of her before she had registered the sound of the door. "Come with me," he said. It was the most direct thing he had ever said to her. She followed him back through the dining room door, into the room of 12 covers and 12 faces, and the dowager in her chair with her fan held at its customary height, and Miss Cowell at her right hand, watching with an expression that had finally become unguarded enough to be readable as something like unease. Julian stood at the head of the table. He said into the silence his entry had produced, "She is not a maid. She is Cecily Vane of Wrenhollow." 11 words, quietly delivered. The room held them the way a held breath holds air. The dowager's fan was still. Miss Cowell looked at her plate. The neighboring families looked at each other, and then away with the careful tact of people who understand that they are witnessing something significant and that the correct response is to find a private moment to discuss it later. Julian did not look at his mother when he said it. He looked at Cecily. She understood in that moment that the statement was not only a defense, it was a declaration. Not of love, not yet. There would be time for what that meant, and it would come later, in the proper form, with all the procedural weight the period required. The declaration of Wrenhollow, she is of Wrenhollow, had a meaning she felt in her chest before she could think about it. A warmth that spread outward from the same place where the cold air usually lived. The Dowager Duchess looked at her son for a long moment with the expression of a woman recalibrating. She was not cruel. She had never been cruel. She was simply a woman whose entire understanding of the world had organized itself around a particular order, and that order had just been quietly revised by the only person in the room with the authority to revise it. She looked at her fan. She lowered it by half an inch. "I see," she said. Which was not agreement, and not further opposition either. It was a woman deciding that the particular shape of this battle was no longer one she could afford to fight in this room. Mr. Halsworth, the steward, appeared at the dining room door in the manner of a man who had been waiting. He produced a document and held it toward the table. He said, without particular inflection, that he had received, that morning, a letter from a solicitor in Norwich who had handled the Hargrove estate and who had found, during a recent review of old correspondence, a letter from the late Mr. Hargrove himself, acknowledging that the 400 pounds in question had been spent by his own hand, without Mr. Vane's knowledge, on a debt he had not wished his family to discover. He had not shown this letter to anyone. He had died before he could correct the record. His son had found it filed in the wrong correspondence and had, belatedly, forwarded it to the appropriate parties. Henry Vane's name was clear. Cecily stood in the dining room of Wren Hollow Park and listened to this with her hands at her sides and her face composed because she had learned, in 23 years, and particularly in the last 18 months, that the face is the only thing a woman in her position can control, absolutely. Her eyes stung, and she did not prevent that, because some things deserve to sting. It was Julian who crossed to her then. Not in haste. In the slow, particular way of a man moving through a space he has decided to occupy. He did not speak immediately. He simply stood beside her, so that she was not standing alone in front of the room, and the quality of his presence beside her said what his words would formalize later, in private, in the proper and careful way of a man who does nothing carelessly. The season at Wren Hollow continued. Miss Cowell returned to her own family's estate within the week, having discovered, in the manner of sensible women confronted with a situation that has resolved itself without their participation, that she had other engagements requiring her attention. The Dowager Duchess remained. She was not displaced from Wren Hollow. She was simply quietly, no longer the architect of its future. There is a difference, and she understood it. The adjustment was not easy for her. She was not, in the end, a foolish woman, and she had raised a son who was less blind than she had required him to be. And she found, slowly, that this was not the worst thing she could say of him. The letter from Norwich was presented, eventually, to the appropriate legal body in Ashby Cross. The record was formally amended. Henry Vane's name returned to the registry of his village as what it had always been, an honest man. Cecily did not weep when she was told. She stood in the still room with the letter in her hand, and she thought about her father's careful handwriting, and she permitted herself a very long moment of perfect stillness. Then she went back to work. There was, by Christmas, a formal offer made in the proper form and accepted in the same. The household celebrated with appropriate warmth. Mrs. Booth allowed herself a glass of sherry and did not comment on the fact that she had known, from approximately the third week of her employment, that this was where the whole thing was going. The book of Cowper's poems found a permanent home on the shelves of the library. The Cowper shelf was the one nearest the fire. On a morning in late December, the first snow of the winter fell on Wren Hollow Park. Julian stood at the window of the small sitting room he had given over to Cecily's use, a room that had been used for correspondence, overlooking the kitchen garden and the orchard wall, and watched the snow settle on the old apple tree. She came to stand beside him. Neither of them spoke immediately, because some things do not require words, and the silence between two people who have chosen each other freely has a different quality than all other silences. He reached into his coat pocket. He produced a small sprig of dried thyme. She recognized it. She had left it at the tree in October. The last bundle before the frost made the ground impassable, and she had not realized he had collected it. He set it on the windowsill, between the glass and the cold. Outside, the snow fell on the tree, and on the ground she had tended, and on the name that the world had returned to its rightful weight. Inside, the fire in the small sitting room held its warmth against the winter, and the sprig of thyme stood between them on the sill, and she looked at it for a long, quiet moment before she looked up at the man beside her. She was seen. Fully, finally, without condition. That was enough. That had always been enough. If this story found a place in you, leave a word below, a season, a name, a feeling. These stories are made to be shared quietly, the way good things always are. Thank you for staying until the end.